Okay, here we go. I'll stick my usual comment to let people know that they can say hi as they join. We can wait a minute or two whilst everyone gets the notification. That'll start coming through. There we go. But yes, how are you feeling today? I haven't actually properly checked in yet. Has it been a good work day? Not as busy?
Not as busy as usual, no. It's the usual workday of jumping between projects that we do have and projects which we are trying to get. So that's usually the combination we're trying to balance in each and every day. How about yourself then?
Mine's been a pretty straightforward focusing on one main project, trying to get things moving before a deadline kind of day. So it's quite good to be able to step back and do a bit of a live stream as well and mix it in. Oh, we're joined by Natalie. Hi, Natalie. It's good to see you. Haven't spoken in a while.
Hi there, Natalie.
Give people a moment longer. I know that we've hit a time where people might be trying to come in and out of work as well.
Natalie, let us know how things are going in the Isle of Wight in the comments section as well, because I think it's been a while since we've had a chance to speak to.
Definitely. And the project that I was going flat out on today was around Hampshire and Isle of Wight, so it's always good to get an update there as well. Seeing another couple of people joining, so please do say hi as you join. It's always good to know we're not just talking into the void. Oh, we've got Lynn there, Lynn. Well, hi, Lynn. It's good to have our usual live stream team keeping us company today. I'm sure we'll be having a few Q&A sections as well. So if any of you want to ask questions as we go, I'll be keeping half an eye on the comments throughout. Okay, well, we're a couple of minutes in, Aidan. I might kind of start with some of the basic introduction and we can go from there. So today's live stream, for those of you who have kind of joined before, is going to be a little bit different to our usual, just in the sense that it's often me interviewing the guests of the day, but actually today we're going to be mainly focusing on the projects that we do within WAVE that look at embedding trauma-informed practice across the UK. And I'm joined today by my fellow project manager within WAVE, Aidan. So we'll be having a bit more of an informal conversation around the projects we both do, rather than having it be more of a question and answer between the two of us. Before I get to the proper introductions, though, I just wanted to mention the fact that we are going to be discussing trauma today, and whilst it's unlikely to be anything particularly triggering, sometimes it can still be distressing, or it can make you remember things you've been through previously. So I just wanted to kind of flag up some of the resources here that you can have for support. We usually find that it's enough to just ground yourself back in the moment. So, you know, take a few deep breaths in and out. Use some of the different grounding techniques that are out there that you may have come across before. If that isn't enough, feel free to just get up, you know, take a little walk, get yourself a drink, come back when you're calmer. But if you do need more support, we have both a Council of Lived Experience peer support network for those with lived experience of trauma at Hearts of Ace, and you can see the email address there on the slides. And there's also some wonderful charities there that are able to give you more immediate support if that's something you need as well. But yes, Aidan, would you like to get us started with a bit of an introduction around you and your role as project manager within WAVE?
Yes, certainly. So my title is Trauma Informed Communities Project Manager, and I first got that title when I was naturally working on a project which involved trying to spread this awareness of trauma and resilience across the wider community, not just to the practitioners and people on the front line, but to the residents in the area as well. So I maintained that title over time, but my focus has been quite a bit broader. I tend to get involved in any project which involves embedding trauma-informed practice to one extent or another. So there'll be some projects where we're doing large-scale training. There'll be other projects where we are offering consultancy to individual services. And there'll be other ones which are, just like my original title, focused on spreading the awareness across the wider community.
Thanks, Aidan. I'm seeing Mark's joined us in the comments there as well. So hi, Mark. And you're more likely to have seen me on these live streams before, but I'll give a bit of an introduction here as well. My name is Isabel. I've been involved with Wave for over 7 years, and as Aidan said, we're quite a small team, even though we work on really big national projects and sometimes international projects as well. So I've actually had a variety of roles over the years, including supporting with setting up trauma-informed communities, supporting in delivering training, supporting with some of the early years projects and the research projects we do. I think my previous title was research assistant, but my current role is the project manager for police and criminal justice. So I'm really taking the lead on the projects that have that little bit more focus on the criminal justice side, as we know that it's one of the key areas where trauma has such a huge impact to everyone involved, really, staff and any of the service users. So yeah, I think we were just hoping to have a bit of a discussion today to let you know a bit more of what Wave does. We know that in terms of our online presence, we very often talk about the 70/30 campaign and the brilliant advocating we're doing there for primary prevention, but we haven't gone into great detail around talking about how we actually set about spreading trauma-informed practice. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to kind of kick off that discussion. I'm seeing Angela's joined us as well. Hi, Angela. So yeah, Aidan, I guess my first question here was, what's the most exciting part about spreading trauma-informed practice in the UK?
I mean, when you go about doing the training, one of the most exciting parts of that is when people start asking questions, because sometimes people can just passively take on board everything you're saying and not really challenge it. And granted, a lot of people are working in similar ways, so they're often quite on board when it comes to the mindset. But it's when people are actually starting to challenge the concepts and trying to get underneath the nuances and working out how you balance it with other things. That's what I find particularly interesting, because I think that's when you start to go down a route where you're going to try and find ways to realistically embed it. Because there's a lot of important things to cover there, and a lot of things that people agree with, but you often have to balance it with the needs of the service, the needs of the customers, and everything else that's going on there too. When you do get around to actually putting it in place, I mean, one of the most exciting parts of it is doing the evaluation at the end, and that is because you actually get to see the impact of it. I remember we did a couple of large-scale training projects in Hampshire and Tower Hamlets, and there were more than 50 training sessions in both of them. And for the first time, we ended up doing a qualitative evaluation. We were interviewing people not just to get a score for what they thought their knowledge of each area was out of a scale of 1 to 10, but to ask, what changes have you actually now made as a result of this training? And I remember the first one I did, I was going into it really unsure as to whether we were going to hear anything. You know, these people had only done like a half-day training. I didn't know how much they'd have gotten out of it. And the first person was just reading off a number of things that they'd actually done in practice, you know, for themselves, when working with colleagues, when looking at the whole organization. And that was a trend that followed on for interview after interview after interview, sometimes to different extents, but always with some sort of change there. And so that was really inspiring to actually go through. And now whenever we get to the evaluation at the end of each project, now I'm really interested to actually see what we found there too.
Yeah, I have to say, I think it's always a relief when we see that people have taken the time to fill out the feedback forms and that kind of thing, because it always gives you a little bit more of a concrete idea of what impact you're able to have and how it's really spreading the positive impacts that trauma-informed practice can have. I think that one of the areas I've really enjoyed with the larger trauma-informed projects has really been that shift in understanding that becoming trauma-informed is a long-term journey, not kind of a one-off exercise. You know, it's not good enough to just say, we're going to do a 2-hour training and now I'm fully trauma-informed. It's when you understand that actually, first of all, there's no kind of one-off end goal, but it's this completely transformation in way of being, in way of approaching the world, in way of understanding other people and your own behavior. And I think it's when you start to see those initial conversations of people who haven't really connected those same dots yet that start to actually understand all of the different ways that they can make a difference longer term. That makes such a huge difference. So I know that you mentioned the trauma-informed training project we did in Hampshire, for example. So I'm currently leading on the follow-up project to that was very much a result of that understanding of the longer-term process, where we're now working on a multi-agency basis across Hampshire to really look at how to embed trauma-informed practice across not only Hampshire, but Isle of Wight and Portsmouth and Southampton as well. And we're looking at a good, 18 organisations there across criminal justice. So that's police, prisons, probation, youth offending teams, but also health, adult services, children's services, local authority. And I think it's when you start off with that very basic, let's do an introduction training, let's let people know about ACEs and what trauma is, and you see it all the way to this really fits into this organization's ultimate goals. It's really rewarding to see that longer term shift.
I also think it's quite exciting when you're coming near the end of a project, especially, and you can see the plan ahead. Because usually with these projects, you either have a tender which has a certain time span, or the organisation you're working with only has a certain budget. And so at one point, you are going to end your support, but the practice is hopefully going to continue afterwards. And so when you can see a pathway forwards to actually making it sustainable, you know that what you're doing hasn't just been, done in vain. So I'll give you one example. I mentioned the Tower Hamlets project there. Nearing the end of that, we were going to do some additional training sessions for trauma-informed champions. People who've been through the main trauma-informed training were going to come on board, and we do a bit of a workshop to see how they could influence their organisations from the inside. And rather than just do these sessions, the person who we were working with actually set up a network for these people to communicate afterwards. Now, what I really liked was Isabel and I went on to work with another organisation in East London not long afterwards. And the person who didn't know we worked with Tower Hamlets got in touch and said, oh, well, they have this network of trauma-informed champions. They're asking us if we can promote this to the new trainees. And it was lovely just to see that this hadn't just ended after the project ended. This has continued. This is going to continue for a while, and they're going to keep making progress beyond the time when our support has ended. So that's always really quite encouraging to see, because that's what you want to do. You don't just want to offer some training, give a bit of advice, make a couple of changes, but see it all end. You want to know something's going to get better and better into the future.
And that's why we're doing this work ultimately as WAVE. We know what kind of impact trauma-informed practice can have on individuals who experience it, but we also know the ripple effects that a good trauma-informed service can have. Which is one of the key reasons we put so much time and effort into it as a charity, when our kind of main goal is primary prevention. There's a reason why trauma-informed practice is still such an important part of what we do. So no, 100%. I think it's always rewarding to see those longer-term impacts. You triggered another thought there, Aidan, which is, I know that a lot of the people joining us today are 70-30 ambassadors, WAVE volunteers in one way or another, and it occurs to me that a lot of them might not have a complete picture of a lot of the funding processes that come around the projects, and how that can link in some of the positives of the project, some of the difficulties that we have as project managers. And I was wondering if you could give some examples of the different ways that we often end up starting projects, and how that can have repercussions on the type of projects we're able to do or not able to do.
No, certainly. The fundraising almost always ends up taking more time than you plan for in beforehand, but that's always because you're trying to get it right. So one way, for instance, is tenders. So whenever a local authority or another organisation is looking to put out a contract, which they often legally have to do if it goes above a certain amount, they'll put it on certain websites where we'll have alerts at all times. Now, the alerts are sometimes not that brilliant. So the other day I managed to get one for security at a homeless accommodation. That's not exactly our area. I'm not quite sure how that got brought up. But mostly you'll get ones which, trauma-informed training, trauma-informed support in schools, trauma-informed auditing, or some other area that we'll work in. So we take that on board. What it will do is it will give you a deadline to get a response by. They'll write the specification, everything they want. Some go into a lot of detail, some try and keep it quite broad, and they want you to interpret it. And they also tell you what you need, any governance documents, your estimates for the costs and other certain things. And then they'll give you a response document. And if they're really kind, it will be a couple of 500-word questions. And if they're not, it will be a few 1,000-word questions along with a load of smaller ones too. Some want more information than others. And then you have to go through the process of trying to get the best score you can. Because what they'll do is they'll score you in two ways. They score you on quality. Question A may have 8 out of 8 points, question B, question C, and 8 points will be for absolutely excellent. You went above and beyond and everything. 0 will be you didn't answer the question the slightest, and you have gradients in between. You then have what is usually a smaller score for the pricing itself. And what they do is, let's say pricing is 20% of the overall score. Those 20 points go to the person with the lowest price, and then the rest of the points are in relation to whatever that price was. And so you're always going into it trying to get this balance between, I want the quality, and I want to make sure we don't just do a lot of stuff for free or do a lot of stuff on the cheap. and I also want to make sure I win this pricing one. And you go through this whole process first, where firstly we'll do the time cost estimates. We want to get a feel for, this is what we'd ideally like to do. This is how much time it would take. This is how much it would cost to do. And then from then on, usually you start chopping back. You go, okay, what's actually going to be a competitive bid? Okay, let's chop back some of the less ideal, some of the less necessary stuff, and get back to what we actually need. And there's always some negotiation going on with the team. We're very good at working as a team on this, and we go back and forth on things in meetings and otherwise. And the same when it comes to drafting the sections, we'll split it between ourselves. We'll all do a bit of a draft, and then we'll read for each other's, and we always challenge each other. Go, okay, you haven't answered the question this way. You missed out this bit. This doesn't make sense. This doesn't come across right, and you challenge it that way. And then you submit it, and at that point, you are very much in the hands of the gods and hoping that you've got a better score than someone else.
No, you just triggered a thought there, Aidan, around us all kind of chipping in with that fundraising process. And I do think it's one of the strengths of Wave having such a small team, and that is that you get to have the feedback from everyone in terms of what goes into it and the different understandings of the project. But it's also not, someone who spends all of their time on fundraising and only has that kind of view from the marketing perspective, but it is the project managers themselves who understand the projects, understand what's necessary, what has bigger impact, etc., that are really involved in that kind of not just the time cost estimates, but really building it into the questions and how you're phrasing it and what the priorities are, and which opportunities are or aren't chased after and looked at. So I think it is one of the real ways that we're able to make the most of those situations. I also think around the funding specifically, there's quite a few elements that might not be obvious to everyone. I think over my time at Wave, I've seen a huge shift in the amount of opportunities there are linked to trauma-informed practice, which is another way that we can really see the impact that's not only being had by us, but by ambassadors, by other organizations pushing forward on trauma-informed practice. We've gone from it not really being funded or looked at to it actually coming out quite regularly. Lots of local authorities looking at it, government more broadly looking at it, individual organizations looking at it. We've got schools, police forces, there's such a broad spectrum of people starting to look at it. But I think definitely from the funding perspective, we at Wave still see that the majority of attention is more towards that kind of trauma-informed element, more towards the support later on in life than it is at the primary prevention level. It is always harder to secure that funding for the prevention projects that we would love to be doing more of. And I think that is something really important to understand in how we're pushing forward and advocating. It's to always make sure that the decision makers have prevention at the front of their mind in what we're doing, because that's one of the ways that you can start to actually do projects around them and move things forward across the UK in that element. I don't know if you've got any other thoughts on how those different projects develop based on some of the funding restrictions.
I mean, I was going to bring in the notion of early years prevention, and there are a number of reasons why there is more work out there regarding trauma-informed practices than that. Firstly, early years prevention happens within the early years sector. So apart from your occasional enterprising violence reduction unit or a local authority that really wants to invest in it, you have to look for early years sector services and departments that have the money. Trauma-informed, you can effectively go any public service because it's relevant across any of them. So you've got a more narrow field there. You've also got a field that's experienced a lot of cuts in recent years. I mean, during austerity, the number of cuts to health visiting in particular, often through the public health grant, was really quite severe in some areas, and they still struggle to maintain those major health checks. So even though the government has now allocated more money to them, it's not actually as much as was recently taken away. So you've got these difficulties actually providing the standard services before they even come on to offering any more. And then there's also the fact that if you're looking to invest money in an area, with trauma-informed practice, you will get results quite quickly. I've seen schools who've cut their exclusion rates within the year, prisons cut their assaults rates within the year, police forces, social services, housing got better results in a short time span. Prevention will give you good results in a short time span, but it'll often be more obscure things that aren't as obvious to councils. Better results when it comes to secure attachment levels. Very important throughout the life, not as immediately obvious as a benefit as, say, lower exclusion rates to someone who's not as well acquainted with the knowledge. And then when it comes to the longer term goals, of course, it can take years and years to happen. Well, if you're having to deal with a lot of immediate crises, if you're trying to justify the money in the here and now, then often it's just a safer bet, especially if you are at that stage where you just want to show some results and perhaps want to be able to get the credit for the results as well, for your party or for your administration at that time. So it's for those reasons and a number of others that you do tend to find that a lot of money's there when it comes to trauma-informed practice, but not quite as much for the early years prevention. But of course, you still look out for the opportunities wherever you can.
Definitely. And I think one of the other elements is that, you know, there's starting to be the understanding within trauma-informed projects that you can evaluate the project for short-term changes, but that the real impact of trauma-informed practice is longer term. So say if you funded a training program, you can start to measure how the practitioners who were changed their behavior. You can start to impact that, but actually to see, say, some of the longest term impacts on well-being within the community, for example, that might take much longer to see the impacts and to start to see it fully embedded. Also because it takes a moment to go beyond that initial training to fully embedding it. One of the main types of projects that I've been leading on in the last year or so has been looking at our organizational self-assessment tool that kind of takes a snapshot of current levels of trauma-informed practice. And one of the reasons I found that really interesting is because it shows all the different areas that need to be impacted by the trauma-informed lens when you get further down the line on the journey. So it's not just training, it's whether or not leadership is fully on board, it's whether or not all the policies have been looked at through a trauma-informed lens, it's whether the physical environments have been considered from a trauma-informed lens, which obviously from a budget perspective for organizations, takes some time. It's not always possible to start from scratch and rethink things. I see that particularly with police, in custody suites. It's much easier to build a new building that has trauma-informed principles in mind than it is to update a really, really old building that has had many, many problems for years in terms of its physical consideration. And so I think that there is starting to be that understanding within some of the trauma-informed funding that sometimes you need that longer-term lens as well, to start looking at the successes as much as the learning opportunities.
Absolutely, and it's really encouraging to see that we are just getting more in-depth projects coming out. Even when it comes to training, it's training which is happening over a longer time period, that's more in-depth, that's more supported by other things. There's more consultancy coming, there's more auditing and organizational assessment. And I think part of this will just be that we've had a few years now within which it's become well known, and that's enough time for most of the councils to look at this situation and say, actually, we need to work on this long term if we're going to get any results. It's enough time to show some of the better examples of what's happening across the UK. So for instance, in Islington, they've been doing a schools project where they work with each individual school for 2 years as part of a cycle. And they are very gradually working their way through all the schools in the borough and supporting them properly and making sure the sustainable support is in there long term. Examples like that and the results they're getting early on are going to inspire other areas. I think it's also quite helpful that as much as we're also getting a lot more discourse on a national level, especially in the Celtic nations, so in Scotland in particular, the Scottish government is very vocal about its support for trauma-informed practice and has actually invested in national frameworks and national teams to look into this. But you'll also get these regional leads as well. We have the violence reduction units, again, inspired by the pioneer in Glasgow, then Scotland, who are taking on board the lessons of the predecessor there and starting to make trauma-informed practice a priority. And because they're drawing together the different services and sectors, they can be quite influential. They have a lot of connections, and then they're starting to influence the local areas and the sort of thinking they're putting into how they're going to approach this. So, we're going in the right direction. It's just going to take a bit of time to get it there everywhere.
I think this is one of the great opportunities to kind of take it back to our audience, if you will, Aidan, because a big part of keeping that momentum going is keeping that excitement going, keeping that pressure going from the general public as well for trauma-informed practice. And I know that so many of the ambassadors that will be joining us today have been playing a huge part in that effort. And I just wanted to remind anyone who is listening that you're welcome to add any questions that you've got for either of us in the chat, either around what it's like to embed trauma-informed practice or what some of our projects are like or anything along those lines. So feel free to stick some comments and to stick some questions in the comments as we go. I think I'll stop in 4 or 5 minutes as well to see if we can have a bit of a Q&A session, but have a bit of a think now. So yeah, Aidan, I was wondering if to give us a bit of an example, if you could maybe pick one of our training projects that we've had in the last few years and walk people through it and give them a bit of an idea of what it means to get trauma-informed training, what are the main topics we cover, what are the different options that we could have for training, in case anyone's interested for their organisation or to advocate for it in their local community.
I'll pick the Hampshire example. That was a pretty successful one because we actually managed to get more people than we were aiming for, thanks to some really effective marketing by our partners and the local police and crime commissioner. So yes, we offered over 50 sessions, and they were mostly 3.5 hour ones. And what we did was, because we didn't want to offer a full day, because that would have been quite difficult for staff to find the time to get to, we had sort of a first half, which was understanding the trauma, and second half, which was implementing trauma-informed practice. And people would sign up for one and the other separately. Now, what we will often do is we'll have our standard training content. And, when you're talking about the scientific theory around trauma, resilience, attachment, and these related topics, it's pretty similar content regardless of who you're talking to. You can tailor the case studies a bit, you can tailor the analogies a bit, but generally we're talking about those basic emotional needs. It's when you get into the second half that you can start tailoring it a bit more to different services and sectors. So you have your general principles and framework of trauma-informed practice, but then maybe discussing past adversities might be more relevant for health workers than other ones. Maybe talking about the impact it has on people's perspectives of authority would be more relevant to police officers than other sectors. We also started to introduce a bit more context around vicarious trauma and the impact of engaging with traumatic incidents as a result of working with police forces, because they're going to be on the front line and dealing with this regularly. And what we did in Hampshire was that we had a series of different trainings. So we had a mixed health one, and then we had a one for early years, we had another for GPs, and then we had the remainder, which was a mixture of often youth offending, social services, probation, and a lot of work in communities that way. And so we tailored the case studies and we tailored the analogies and the specific content to each audience. And we do this with everyone we work with, don't we? I mean, we try to make sure that it's as relevant as possible for people. So I think put those sessions out. What we do is we put them out on Eventbrite, and the aim is to put out as many as possible at completely different times, completely different dates, so that anyone can find availability, because people have very busy schedules, and you want to make sure they're going to be able to fit it into their time, and that's how you get the bigger attendance overall. Now, admittedly, you're never going to get as many attendees as you have signees. You always have some drop off, especially in sectors like health, where, I occasionally get an email saying, sorry, I'd have loved to turn up, but there's a massive emergency at our hospital and I have to go. And I'm not even going to ask what that is. That's obviously more important than the training session they had to get to. But the aim is if you can get at least 70% of the signees turning up and then send out the link to the rest and ask them to sign up again, then you're doing pretty well.
Yeah, I think that's some great examples there, Aidan. I think it's also worth saying that some of that work of tailoring it to the local situation is understanding when longer sessions are more useful, when shorter sessions are more impactful, because it means it reaches a wider audience. There's also a case of understanding when virtual training is more powerful versus in-person training. I think in the Hampshire case was one of the situations in which virtual was much more useful because it allowed for multi-agency training. It allowed to make the most for interactions across different organisations and different inputs, and it also meant that people were able to fit it into their working day without having to worry about travel and different considerations there. Whereas I know that we're currently in the process with our project with Devon and Cornwall Police of organising in-person training with some of those key departments we've identified as part of a broader project, because actually not only is the relationship building part of the training going to be really crucial to the broader project, but it's also going to be crucial for them to have much more scope for the interactions of what they're doing, because it's not just the basic awareness training, it's just not opening doors. It's much more tailored to, okay, we've identified key departments such as learning and development, such as those who are responsible for training up leadership, such as policy and procedure. We now need to work with them individually for how trauma-informed practice impacts their specific work. And so there it might be much, much more powerful to do in-person training. So I think that a lot of what we do with our training is always tailoring it to the local situation, tailoring it to the client, and understanding how that fits in more broadly. I know we do things like think through case studies in different ways. A thought that's coming to mind now is when we did training with the University of East London, we'd kick off the training showcasing some of the research that they had done internally in terms of the number of adversities that some of their first year students had experienced. It was much, much more powerful to talk about adverse childhood experiences when you had some data around actually this is what's happening in your university. So we really do a lot of work to tailor it to whatever we're doing in that instance.
UEL was a particularly interesting one because I remember I was speaking to, I think she went on to be the Dean of Students eventually, who ended up kickstarting the process. So we were talking to her for a long time, and we ended up giving a speech to the student researchers who went out and took a part in that research. So by the time we first did the training, we were showcasing results which hadn't even been published yet. So that's a great way to really tailor it to the organisation in a way they wouldn't have come across before. I'm going to pick up on the notion of virtual in person, by the way, because actually I think it's relevant to projects and not just the training side of things. Um, Sometimes it can be very helpful. You know, if you need to really go through a document and go through a plan, you can get up on screen. You can both amend it as and when you're there, and especially a big group can do it. That's really handy. And obviously, if you were working remotely, then you can still get people together on a regular basis. There's lots of benefits to virtual, and you know the time you save from traveling ends up getting put into other parts of the project as well. Which, as someone who had to travel back and forth to places over and over again, I can tell you it does make a hell of a lot of difference to how much you can get into your day. Problem is, though, sometimes, especially if people are very busy, if they're not as responsive, sometimes it can end up just creating delays compared to if you really could just walk into a room and ask them about it. And it's the same within the team as well. Sometimes we have to go speak to our other team members about something, and we could have just walked into the room or swiveled around in our chair in an office and got it done there and then. But nowadays, sometimes you have to, obviously, if someone's busy or doing something else, it may take a couple of days to hear back from them. So it's a real kind of double-edged sword, I'm noticing, now that we're working more remotely. How do you find it, Isabel?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of pros and cons. I mean, I'm sure we're far from the only organisation finding this post-COVID. You know, I'm seeing some of that advantages and disadvantages of virtual learning in some of the qualitative feedback we're getting in our projects, because one of our open-ended questions we have in our organizational assessment is very much around the physical environment. And there's so many organizations now saying, yes, the physical environment isn't bad, but actually I'm working from home the majority of the time. So if you're asking me if the location is trauma informed, you're asking me if my house is trauma informed, if you know I have space with the kids and everything else. And so there's considerations like that, I think, are really interesting ways in which everyone's work life has really shifted to this, as you say, double-edged swords, pros and cons in different senses. But I think that we're able to, I think, do much more international work now that it's much more standard to work long distance. I know that quite a lot of my work is networking. You know, it's not definitely the main part, but there's a lot of learning from international work. There's finding out what's going on. And I think if there wasn't the standard of working on Zoom, working on Teams, I wouldn't be able to talk to police officers in Australia about what they're doing. I wouldn't be able to talk to people in Canada about some of the trauma-informed work that's happening there. And I think that it does open a lot of doors that weren't previously there in a different sense. And I know that, again, I think if you compare, say, my two main projects at the moment, which are either Devon and Cornwall Police or the broader, longer-term Hampshire project, I think it makes far more sense for the Hampshire project to be virtual, because you're working with 18 different organisations and different offices at different times. There's no point trying to do it in person because you'd never find the right person to speak to anyway. It's much more useful to have their phone number, to be able to pull them all together into one big Zoom meeting for an hour just to get proper feedback. It's much more powerful to be able to send out questionnaires to everyone rather than try to speak to everyone individually across all those organizations, or the budget would be astronomical. Whereas if you're working with one individual organization, it makes much more sense to have moments that are definitely in person. So as I mentioned, we're going to be doing that training in a few weeks. But I also went and visited Exeter back in July of last year for a few days, got to know the key people involved in the project, got to see the physical environment in person. I saw the command room, the custody suites, etc. And I think that was really crucial to work with one single organization. And that's to say, it's an organization that still has quite a broad geographical spread across, Cornwall and all of Devon. They're quite different environments, but it still made a difference to be able to go there and meet the team, and to have one meeting in person, or to pop in on someone's lunch break and catch someone who otherwise wouldn't have been able to spare 10 minutes. So yeah, I think there's definitely pros and cons in different situations.
Absolutely. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things develop from here on, because as a team we're pretty scattered far and wide across not just the UK but Europe too. So it'll be quite interesting to see if we do get projects that are nearby us, and we can start to go around and meet people face to face on a regular basis, especially during the consultancy, not just the training as well, how that actually changes from here on. and whether or not they want to meet us. They might just want to speak to us over Zoom because they're so used to it by now.
Definitely. I'm gonna give us a moment, Jay. Sorry, I saw Jay's name in the comments and got distracted there. Aidan, I'm gonna give us a moment to do a bit of a Q&A now, because it would be great to hear from the people we've got on today if they've got any questions around embedding trauma-informed practice. So I'm gonna drink some water and give everyone a moment to think of some questions. I don't know if you want to kick things off as well there, Aidan, but we'll keep an eye out on the comments.
I'll join you with the water.
Problem with talking for half an hour.
Oh, I always find that whenever I'm training, I have to surround myself with cups of water just because my mouth gets dry very quickly early on. I made the mistake once doing training in a school where we packed 60 people into a room with the windows shut, so it's a very warm room. I'd forgotten to have a drink beforehand, and my voice just went hoarse within about 5 minutes of starting. So I had to quickly run and get one.
Oh, we've got a question here from Jay. How do you best see this all being implemented? What do you think the best approach is to getting trauma-informed practice implemented? I'm assuming it is the question there.
Within individual services, I mean, there are a number of things there. Firstly, you really need the senior team on board. I mean, whenever I come across an organisation that's actually gotten good results from it, you always found it was led by the head teacher, the chief constable, the CEO of the housing association, or whoever it was. Like, it makes a massive difference in terms of everyone seeing it as a priority. So that's one thing that's really key, is to win them over. The other one is to make sure that I think you have to have very honest conversations to begin with about your current practice, because some people can get very defensive, especially if they've been doing it for years, especially if they feel like, you know, their job is under attack if they don't get good results, and get quite defensive about what they're currently doing. And I think you do need that confidence to be able to look at the situation to say, actually, this is an area we could do much better in. And that's where the auditing kind of comes in handy, because you can really identify specific parts of the organization or your practice where you really need to work on. There's a couple of things that I find particularly relevant there. I think one thing that's been quite handy, and I've noticed this and it links into the first one, is having a consistent team who know each other well. So if you constantly have staff turnover, firstly, it's quite difficult to keep things going if you have implemented things. But also, if you're beginning from that point where everyone knows each other well on first name terms, it's a lot easier to be honest with each other. You know each other's practice well, so you know you can make changes more easily, and you just have that good team dynamic when you're going through what can be, you know, quite a lot of upheaval and quite a lot of change. So those are three things I think that make quite a big difference to whether or not an organisation is actually going to succeed in this.
Yeah, I think I'd kind of pick up on those points actually with some concrete examples from my own projects. I think the one that sprung to mind immediately for me is what I've been concentrating on the last few weeks. So we're currently doing a bit of feedback around Lancashire's custody suite. So we've got a wonderful associate consultant called Julian Moss. He's got 30 years in experience within policing. He's worked across 4 different forces. You know, he's led for the National Police Chiefs Council on things like public health approaches within policing, serious violence reduction, and has been amazing in trauma-informed practice as well, as he was part of the work in Gloucestershire to set up a trauma-informed network. And he went to visit the 4 different custody suites in Lancashire in person and interviewed not only detention officers, but custody sergeants, liaison and diversion, the detainees themselves, and kind of had a conversation there. And it really stood out to me, some of what you were saying there, Aidan, that what has happened there so far, and they very much were upfront from us from the start, that they're at the beginning of their journey, is that there is incredible amounts of what I would call implicit good practice of people who really get trauma-informed approaches, even if they don't know the language. They really get that relationships are how you get good results. They really understand that you need to be compassionate and empathetic. They understand the importance of active listening. They understand that everyone, regardless of anything, deserves dignity. And you can really see that shining through. But where you start to see inconsistencies, where you start to see areas that still really need a lot of work, it often comes through because there hasn't yet been clear directives from leadership that this is actually what they want to work towards. And you can see that because, again and again, they mentioned, for example, work that's being done with veterans, because that was something that was done explicitly as part of the policy. And it's a small element that links in with trauma, but they were all talking about it and all keen on it because there'd been that direction from leadership. And whereas trauma-informed practice, whilst a lot of people were starting to do what I would consider trauma-informed practice, there were still pockets that weren't quite there, or some elements that weren't, because they hadn't been given that directive yet. And I think similarly in our Hampshire project, we found out across the 18 organisations how much staff had or hadn't received trauma-informed training. And what we found across the board is that people tended to invest in training for frontline workers, for practitioners, maybe for their managers, but very rarely did senior staff get trauma-informed training or go through the training themselves. And you could really see that then in the obstacles that we got back in some of the qualitative feedback in the discussion, that because management hadn't fully understood what needed to happen, weren't making decisions that were yet fully trauma-informed, it was very hard for them in their day-to-day practice to fully implement it. So yeah, I think really if you are trying to get it completely embedded, leadership is probably where to start. It's not to say that it's the first step, but it's the key step in it being successful longer term.
Another one I think is quite helpful when it comes to just knowing how to adapt the general principles to this specific workplace, because there'll be some quite basic things around staff well-being, relationship building, and other factors which are going to be quite relevant regardless of where you go. But then knowing how to tailor that is always quite key. So I'll use a police example. Actually, this was public protection branch at the police service of Northern Ireland. Now, their focus is on really some of the toughest crimes to deal with. There were high-level domestic violence, rape cases, child abuse, child online pornography. And so you can imagine if you're engaging with that day in, day out, that is going to take its toll on you. And they had high levels of staff absence due to stress, naturally. So as well as trying to bring in some of the more common things that they do across the police force regarding having places to de-stress in, bringing in supervision and other things which would have been relevant to the other roles, what they also did was they brought in a staggered return when a person did need to take time off. So they returned to admin work and admin duties, or they could go via another police role before coming back into that one. Specifically tailored to the fact that, if you are working in online child pornography and then you take a break and then you go straight back into having to assess those images on day one back, it's probably going to lead you to have another stress episode pretty soon afterwards. So it was really interesting to see how they took that concept and just tailored it specifically to their environment. And that's where the years of experience meet the trauma-informed knowledge, and you get the best results.
I think for me, that's reminded me of some of the importance of the, I guess, collaboration again, the tailoring it, but from the lens of bringing in lived experience as well. And the reason you've reminded me of that is because I actually spoke to someone who's now working in the charity sector and is looking at getting their charity fully trauma-informed. But she was a police officer for many years previously, and she herself had been involved in looking at images of child pornography and different elements there. And she was saying that years ago, there was just no consideration for the vicarious trauma risk, for the mental health risk of that, or understanding. But it was interesting because it only occurred to her when we were having the open conversation around trauma-informed practice. She'd never made that connection of some of the own trauma she'd been exposed to until we were really looking at what does or doesn't make sense. And this was in a charity context, so she wasn't necessarily thinking about policing again. But I think that the insight from people who are either service users themselves or staff themselves, so they might have that insight into how things are currently working or not working, but also that kind of external lived experience input of those who've experienced adverse childhood experiences, those who've experienced trauma, those who've experienced all kinds of different difficulties that really do strongly impact in life, really plays into it. And I know that Aidan, you might want to walk us through an example there from the training we were recently doing in Bart's Health that comes to mind, of how the co-production happened within one of the psychiatric wards, around it really not being a case of service users merely coming in and experiencing the service, but them having a say in how they received care and what were the rules and what were the principles in that discussion. Because I think it really makes a difference for people to visualize that when they're talking about trauma-informed practice.
Yeah, I know the one you're talking about. It's the case study of Springbank Ward at the NHS Foundation Trust in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And they spent the first 5 years of their existence doing what a lot of wards do and basically treating the patients as if they have absolutely no ability to make decisions for themselves. You know, you lock the doors after certain hours, there's no glass, there's no ceramic, there's no metal. They have complete control over the program and restraining and tranquilizing them whenever they lose control of their behavior as well. And it wasn't really getting good results, to be honest. And when they started changing things around, one of the things they did, as you say, is that they would still bring in their specialist understanding and they'd still have their programs, but there was a lot more collaborative in terms of how they went about doing it. Do we do it one-on-one? Do we do it in groups? Do we start with this? Do we start with that? You know, what's your interpretation of how your life has, what's happened in your life and how it's affected you today? And you start to make it more of a dialogue. And it's not just the fact that you're just getting more intel about what works best for this person, but also they feel like they have a bit more control over this narrative, which if you've been through significant vulnerability, control is often something that feels like it's lacking. By the way, that does, as with the case with many trauma-informed approaches, a lot of the facets that take part in them. It's not just about each element in isolation, though. So what they also did that made this easier was that they were trying to create opportunities to build closer relationships between the staff and the patients. They'd have a lot more social outings together, for instance, and that will have fed into enabling them to collaborate more effectively on the program as well. They'd also give the patients a bit more autonomy. You know, you can leave any time you want. We have metal and glass on site. You can smoke whenever you want. Things such as that shows them a bit more respect, which then feeds into them feeling they're a bit more capable to start collaborating on the program too. So all the different elements all feed into one another as well.
I think that's a really important one to point out there. Oh, we've been joined by Rob as well. Hi, Rob. Glad you could make it to the end there. I think what I'll do is, Rob, you are invited as well as everyone else to drop any last comments any last questions or comments so that we can keep an eye out for them. But looking at the time, Aidan, I think one of the points I'd like to make is understanding the journey towards being trauma informed and how you can move things forward at each stage. Because I think it can really help sometimes for people to visualize that. Like, how do you actually embed trauma informed practice? So I think, and I'd love your comments at any stage of the journey, Aidan, but I'll give kind of a rough outline for my first impression there. I think that very often we start out from a situation in which people don't really understand why trauma-informed is important. There aren't many people who are passionate about it yet. You know, you're starting from quite a blank slate. And I think at that point is when you really want to start winning people over. And this is where I think trauma-informed champions start to make the biggest difference. So you might be the advocate in an organization, you might be the advocate in a network, you might be an advocate in your local community, and you start to create those key relationships with other people and really highlight how trauma-informed practice, and particularly how an understanding of trauma would allow them to get slightly better results or to understand things more sensibly. I think from there, you often start to get smaller initiatives, smaller situations that might be getting colleagues to go on free trauma-informed training that's available. I think it often develops quite organically at that stage. And I think that things can move to a more concrete part of the journey once you do get leadership on board in some dynamic. And that might not be all the way up at the top. It might be getting part of the team on board. But I think when you're able to start to concretely put a little bit of resources behind it, that's when you can start to see the biggest difference. So, that might be one team versus the whole organization. It might be the whole organization from the get-go. It might be on a multi-agency level sometimes, but it's when you're able to say, yes, okay, let's take the next step. Let's actually start making this happen. I think we're often very strong advocates of starting with training, not necessarily really in-depth training, but just making sure that everyone within the organization, and I will again highlight the everyone, we're talking senior management, but we're also talking admin people, janitors, anyone who is involved in contact with staff and service users. And that just means that everyone's working from the same understanding. Everyone knows what you're on about. Everyone understands the basics of ACEs, understands the basics of how trauma can show up. And really trying to spread as much of that understanding as possible is one of the key first steps. And from there, I think that is when we start to get much more to the tailoring it to the local situation, because there's no one journey to becoming trauma informed. There's no one way of doing it. And I think that's where we find it really useful to come in with more of our tailored projects, more of our consultancy projects, more of our auditing element, because the auditing side, for example, can be really useful because you get a snapshot of, okay, so where are things at now? Because it's often not perfect. You might end up with some of the team who's done really detailed trauma-informed training and has been doing the journey for years, and other elements who've done 2 hours trainings and haven't really looked at it yet. So it's good to get that picture and actually understand what's going on, but also to understand the local challenges. And from there to really come up with a plan of attack and really think of it in a long-term perspective. One of the elements we've done, for example, in our Hampshire project is consider existing local strategies. So if they've already got a strategy document for what public health is going to do, we want to make sure that the priorities of trauma-informed practice fit in with existing structures. So that might be an element of kind of taking it a next step further. And then it's just keeping it on the agenda as much as possible. And that's often where some of the longer term consulting come in as well, because you can kind of keep that on the agenda. How do you actually apply this plan? Because sometimes, unfortunately, plans can become documents on a shelf that are ignored. So you've really got to keep it on the agenda. You've got to keep those passionate trauma-informed champions, and you've got to actually start taking concrete action on those plans. So I just wanted to kind of give that timeline and the idea of the journey, because I think sometimes we talk about embedding trauma-informed practice in very vague sense. I don't know if you've got any additions there, Aidan, that would come through.
I think at some point these services end up looking at how they can do this with partners too. Yeah. And that's always quite encouraging. Like I gave the example of the Islington Schools project. They'll have a network of schools who will get together and talk about, sharing resources, sharing their experiences, so they can try and learn from each other. You also get other examples. I'll give the example of Operation Encompass, a program which involves the schools and police collaborating, so that schools are aware when the police have come across one of their students who has been involved in an incident recently. So eventually, and this is usually after the organisation has actually embedded it internally and at least made some progress that way, you see that they do start to reach out. And that's really what we're hoping is going to happen, within specific sectors. That's good, but also it's going to help to diffuse it across a wider city or a wider town or region, especially as over time, not only do you get the results, but it becomes more normal. It becomes more normal to talk about it as a priority. It becomes more normal to see it in practice. It becomes more normal to see it as just the done thing. And that's that cultural change which we're seeing is happening at maybe a high level in terms of including it in the strategies, but eventually we want to see it happening at the low level as well. And it has in some places. In Glasgow, they use it routinely throughout the education system, and their exclusion rates are about 10% what they used to be 20 years ago. So we know that it's possible. We just need to allow the time for different areas to get there.
And I think that kind of example you gave at the end there, Aidan, of it spreading, really made me think about the fact that a lot of Wave's current work focuses on bigger agencies, bigger organizations, bigger structures that are obviously much more broadly impacted by trauma, but also have the scope often to collaborate amongst themselves and work on a multi-agency level for this. I think the more we normalize trauma-informed practice, the more it becomes a way of thinking, the more it starts to spread to other sectors. So things, I've had some conversations around, what about trauma-informed taxi drivers? What about trauma-informed hairdressers? What about trauma-informed restaurants? Because they're coming into contact with people just as much as anyone else, and the people they're coming into contact with are just as likely to have experienced trauma as anyone else. And it might not be as situations that are as traumatic as, say, police very obviously do, but they're still dealing with people on a day-to-day basis, and trauma-informed practice can still be very valuable. And I think that when you're looking at that really longer term perspective, it starts to become normalized, it starts to become obvious, and it starts to be something that really gets spread into the community itself as well.
Absolutely. And I think you're going to be able to build on things before, as you said. Hairdressers, for instance, you're seeing programs for hairdressers to be able to spot the signs of domestic violence because they're getting in close contact with someone's head, and to be able to subtly pass on information to people that way. Others to have conversations around mental health, because you usually do sit there and chat to your barber when you're getting your hair cut. And so there are these cultural shifts towards seeing mental health as increasingly important and being increasingly okay talking about it, that we're going to be able to build upon no matter what sector you go into.
Yeah, and I think that kind of talking about being able to build upon things triggered another thought. I think a lot of what I've found, again, we're talking about that implicit good practice. We've really seen that there's already a push towards things like person-centered or a compassionate approach, or lots of different terms that kind of overlap with trauma-informed practice. And we often kind of are able to build on those existing frameworks that have started to be looked at, or things like child-centered policing. We're able to build on those existing frameworks and say 100% that's headed in the right direction. But if you add the understanding of trauma as well, you get to be that much more powerful. Being compassionate and empathetic is a huge part of being trauma informed, but it's not the only part of being trauma informed. And so I think you really get to build on those blocks that are already in place and that have already had quite a few years development in different sectors and different agencies.
Absolutely, and it kind of helps that everyone comes up with their own different title, and lots of people jump on their own different label. But as long as it focuses on the underlying emotional needs, generally most of the content is the same. Trauma informed includes a bit more about trauma, attachment aware, a bit more about attachment. Everyone will have a bit more about one thing or the other, but they all generally give the same advice and work off the same science. So as long as people realise that all the labels effectively lead in the same direction, then it doesn't matter too much which one they go for, as long as they're doing the practice at the end.
100%. So, Aidan, I'm aware we've got about 5 minutes left. Have you got any key area around either our projects more broadly that we do as project managers, or around embedding trauma-informed practice that you want to make sure we touch on today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping we get to the point where we're not just going to see these one-off tenders come out and these one-off contracts, but we're going to start to see people purposely releasing projects where it's going to go on for years. We don't entirely know what's going to happen in the future, but we know what's going to happen on the immediate horizon, and then we're going to look to do something to embed it a bit further. Then we're going to reach out into the sector we didn't do beforehand. Then we're going to do this and this. And this is why I like it with sometimes you get councils where, this is my goal for 2030, this is our goal for 2040. It's more encouraging because you can't expect them to know everything from the beginning, and you don't know exactly how it's going to go. But just as long as they have that long-term view and they know there is going to be something else, that's the sort of thing I want to see more of now, because it shows that there is that serious commitment to actually doing this properly and sustainably.
Yeah, 100%. I think that understanding that longer term is what's going to be the difference, I think, between now and a few years. We've made that step from people not really understanding the value of trauma-informed to starting to look at trauma-informed practice. I think the next step is not only piloting trauma-informed approaches, but actually really embedding them across much, much bigger sectors of the population in different ways. I'm just glancing through my notes myself because I want to make sure we're not missing out on any of the key elements. I wonder, Aidan, if we could touch upon some of the research side of things as well, because obviously Wave has spent a lot of time and effort on research over the years, but I know that you're probably one of us who's carried out research more recently. I know that focusing on trauma-informed practice, you did some work with the Association of Directors of Public Health as well. That might be worth mentioning.
Yeah, no, so we did a research project where we were going to create 4 briefings. One was on education, health, housing, and policing. And the idea was we'd explain what trauma-informed practice actually looked like in each area, and we'd have a number of case studies too. And in the end, I was quite surprised by the number of people who were coming back and responding when I was requesting interviews, and especially with education. I mean, I decided to just put more time into it than I was originally anticipating, just because I thought I'd take advantage of the opportunity to do this. I must have spoken to nearly 30 people in education alone, but there were 72 overall across all the sectors. And what we were trying to do was just get a feel for, what results have you got, but also how did you get them? What were the most important things you did? What do you think are the priorities to pass on? And we also spoke to some to specifically create case studies on their organisations as well, and would hone in on specific areas. So there was the Key Education Centre in Hampshire, a pupil referral unit, and we specifically focused on their behaviour policy. Because what was it? They called it flexible consistency. Bit of an oxymoron there to talk about how they were trying to simultaneously give that stable, predictable environment while at the same time adapting to each child's needs. And it was a very specific thing they'd done well. So we'd hone in on those areas for each individual service. But what was really helpful here was, we produced the documents, and they're very good documents and very helpful. But it's also just that knowledge we can bring into the training. We can now bring in that case study from Springbank Ward. We can mention that in these live streams. You can mention it in the training sessions. If anyone asks about a specific example within schools, I can bring up the Key Education Centre one. It's just that added knowledge that you bring into the organisation makes everything else you do, it feeds into it. It makes it a little bit easier, makes it a little bit more kind of knowledgeable for the future.
100%. And I will say that most of our publications are on our website as well. We've done huge reports over the years that have fell into national policy in different ways. We've looked at the early years. We've looked at age 2 to 18. We've looked at violence reduction. We've looked at trauma-informed approaches. So if you ever are interested in a bit more of a research perspective, you can find that on the website as well. And as we're wrapping things up, I'll also say that if you're at all interested in training or consultancy or any of the work that we do more broadly, there's also information from that on the website. But Aidan, I think I'll stick up your email address if that's all right, as you give us a final key takeaway message. So if anyone's got any questions for you after the live stream, they know where to find you.
Excellent stuff there. And you wanted a key takeaway message from me as well, was that?
Key takeaway message, yes.
Key takeaway message. Key takeaway message is, I'm going to pick up on all the first things I said. You need to get the senior leaders on board. It helps when you have the entire organization who want to do it, but the head person, they need to have their heart in it, and they need to be willing to put time into it. And when that happens, you're actually going to get results. And when it doesn't happen, you're going to have a lot of internal battles, and you're going to it's going to be difficult to find time to prioritize it. So that'll be my main takeaway.
Thank you, Aidan. And I'll put up my own email address as well if anyone's interested in more of the criminal justice side of our project management as well. And probably my key message would be, really be aware that you can come at trauma-informed practice from 100 different angles and from 100 different starting points and for many different journeys, and it can be tailored to any situation, sector, local challenges, etc. So if you do hit an obstacle, if you do hit a roadblock, don't be disheartened. It's just a case of going back to the drawing board and problem solving and coming back at it. So I know that there's moments when one type of training has been perfect in one situation and not in another, or when it might have been the case that as you said, there might have been staff turnover. So you had someone who was 100% bored and then that shifted. So you've got to rethink how you're approaching it. Really don't give up on this, because we know how big an impact trauma-informed practice is having on an international scale. And we can really start pushing this forward now, the more passionate people there are. So what I'd really say is, stealing, as always, Angela, I don't know if you're still with us, but Angela's main message for all our live streams is don't give up hope and keep pushing forward on that.
Absolutely.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, everyone, for getting involved in the comments as well. I think I'm going to end the broadcast there. Angela's got it there. Never give up hope. Always, Angela. Absolutely. I will steal that for every single live stream going forwards, I fear. But thank you all so much for joining. Aidan, thank you for your time as well. I'm glad we were able to share a little bit more about what we do within WAVE. So we're covering many different areas, and thank you all. But I will let you get on with your evening. Have a great day.
Bye now.